Hey everyone, Digital Scriptorium here, and today I want to show off how to install Debian 13 Trixie step by step from start to finish. This video will be showing installing the Cinnamon desktop environment. However, I will have other guides on my channel showing off other desktop environments being installed as well should you want something different. At the time of making this video, Debian 13 Trixie is in the release candidate phase. However, the official release will be on August 9th, 2025. If you are viewing this video before that date, then you can feel free to take the plunge now and just do a software update to be on the official release version when it comes out, which is no big deal. This guide is intended as a general use case installation of the operating system. I'm going to show off system requirements, how to create the bootable media, how to install the operating system, and then a general tour of the operating system at the end. I won't be going into specific application usage as that is outside of the scope of my guide today. All the links I show off will be included in the description below so you can easily find them if need be. One disclaimer I just want to mention is a warning that this is an operating system install guide where I completely remove the previous operating system. As is with any operating system, you might run into unforeseen issues. So you have to go into this with an open mind that issues might spring up. Worst case, you can always attempt to install a different operating system back on. If you need help, I have many different Windows and Linux guides to accomplish this on my channel. Before I begin, I also just want to mention that if you're feeling generous, to think about donating to support my channel on either Ko-Fi or Patreon. Every bit goes right back into making new guides. Alright, with that all said, let's dive in. So first off, let's talk about minimum system requirements. So the minimum hardware requirements are pretty lean for Debian in general. The key thing to really look for is what you're really trying to get out of it. So for instance, if you're opting for the no desktop option, then minimum RAM is 256 megs of RAM, recommended is 512, and then 4 gigabytes of hard drive space. Whereas if you choose a desktop environment, then you want 1 gig of RAM, 2 gigs recommended, and then 10 gigs of hard drive space. As far as the processor goes, it basically says a Pentium 4 1 GHz system is minimum recommended for a desktop system. And then it also mentions as far as a server-based usage case that it's basically impossible to give a general memory or disk requirement because of what the server would potentially be used for. My general rule of thumb is if you can get by with at least a dual-core processor this day and age, that certainly helps. And then 2 gigs of RAM, definitely minimum. And then just whatever hard drive space you can throw at it, basically. Solid state drive, of course, will speed things up, so it'll be much peppier, but you can still get by with a mechanical hard drive these days on Debian. So at least at the time of making this video, Debian 13 is still just a release candidate. However, I want to show, if you watch this video on or after August 9th of 2025, then the way to download Debian 13 would be as follows. So on Debian's main website, if you click on the download link on the right-hand side, then it would immediately start downloading Debian 13 if it was actually released. I'll go ahead and click cancel for this right now. Now, if you're watching this video before August 9th and you want to download Debian 13, then you can follow these steps. So on the release candidate 2 download link, which I'll have in the description below, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, and then select the last option and just click on that and then just wait for this to download and then we will continue on. So next we need a utility that is going to work the magic in making a bootable USB thumb drive for us utilizing the ISO that we downloaded. This is where Rufus will come in handy. You could use other utilities such as Etcher or there's a few others out there, but however Rufus is the one that I prefer. As it's the simplest, it doesn't require having to be installed at all. It's a standalone executable that you just download and run. So to download Rufus, if we scroll down about a quarter of the way down the page, then you'll find the download section. Most users are going to choose this top one and then just find the latest and greatest version, which should be here, and that should get the job done. However, just to mention, there is also a 32-bit version, aka the x86 variant, and then you can also use the Windows on ARM variant if you wanted to at the bottom. There is the portable version, however, I have not found a use for that. So at least for the sake of this video, I'm downloading this top version. And it's only 2 megs, so it should download pretty fast. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to do open show in folder. I'm just going to minimize the downloads folder for right now. We can close out of the browser that you're using to download everything. We don't need that anymore. At this point, go ahead and plug in your USB thumb drive. I recommend at least a 4 gig thumb drive, if not larger. If you do not have a USB thumb drive on hand, I will have recommended inexpensive thumb drives listed in the description below that you could go with, and they will get the job done. So anyhow, I'm going to plug my USB thumb drive in, and then we will continue on. So I've got my USB thumb drive plugged in. Before we do continue on with Rufus at this point, I do want to go through one extra step, and that is that I've noticed with both Windows 10 and Windows 11 that Windows Defender is very iffy when in regards to Linux-based ISO images being built onto thumb drives. The problem is that it sees that it's operating system files and it believes that they are malicious. This is a false positive that it's snagging those files and basically Pac-Manning them or eating them as they're trying to make their way onto the thumb drive. So what I found is that you will build up a thumb drive and either it will error part of the way through building the thumb drive, or you get to the point of actually installing it on the machine that you want to install it on, and then you start running into really weird errors, or it starts getting slow, or it starts freezing. So I'm going to show you the steps to temporarily turn off real-time protection for Windows Defender. This is not going to permanently damage it in any way. Like I said, this is just temporary. What's basically going to happen is we're going to turn it temporarily off, which buys us about roughly 15 minutes, or until the next time the machine gets rebooted, then Windows Defender will turn back on. So we do partially have to act kind of fast on this. However, we do have a good amount of buffer to get everything built up before Windows Defender were to turn back on. The steps I'm going to show are practically the same in both Windows 10 and Windows 11, so let's go through that now. So go down to the Start menu, and then type in Windows Security. And you should see Windows Security pop up. Let's click on that. Next up, click on Virus and Threat Protection. And then under Virus and Threat Protection Settings, click on Manage Settings. And then this is the section right here that we need to toggle off. So real-time protection, toggle the on to off. You're going to get the UAC prompt. Select yes for this. That's okay. And then we're going to get a little pop-up balloon on the bottom right-hand corner basically saying, hey, something's going on with Windows Defender, and it's just basically giving us a warning. That's perfectly fine. We can just click the X for that, and we can close out of this at this point. So next up, let's go to our downloads folder or wherever you stashed Rufus. So once again, make sure your USB thumb drive is already plugged in before you click on Rufus. So at this point, let's double click on Rufus, select yes for the UAC prompt. And then the first thing that we need to get through is we need to make sure that our thumb drive is actually being detected in the devices section. If your thumb drive is not showing up here, then I would recommend unplugging the thumb drive, give it a few seconds, plug it back in just to reseat it, see if it shows back up. If it doesn't, you can leave the USB thumb drive plugged in, reboot the machine, and then see if it shows up then. Worst case, if it still doesn't show up, then we can manually format it to see if it would maybe play nice for us. And if you do need to manually format it, all you have to do is go to this PC, find your thumb drive, highlight it, right-click on it, select Format, and then you can name it whatever you want. Just one thing also to mention is that when you go to format the thumb drive, it is going to nuke all the data on it. So if there's anything you need to back up, please back it up before you continue this process. And then you would just click Start. If Quick Format is not checked, check it. And then you can just click Start. It'll warn you saying, hey, it's going to delete all the data that's on this thumb drive. You click Yes, as long as you backed up what you need. And then try to relaunch Rufus if need be. So I'm going to go back to the Downloads folder and with Rufus open. So in my case, my thumb drive is showing up on the top, so that's perfect. Next up, let's click on the Select button and then find where Debian 13 was downloaded to. And then once it's been located, in my case, it's just in the Downloads folder, so it made it nice and easy. And then we can click on Open. And then let's close out of everything that you might have open. I'm a big fan of making sure that there is absolutely nothing else running on the machine while we build up the thumb drive. Sometimes people web browse and stuff like that, or they might even fire up a game or some application, and there is always an off chance that it might corrupt some data as it attempts to build the bootable thumb drive. I leave everything as is for defaults, and we're leaving it all up to Rufus to work the magic. The key thing is, before we click on start, once again, this is just a warning that if there is any data on the thumb drive that you need to back up, please back it up now, as it will be formatted and wiped before it puts all the data on that we need for Debian. So just a warning. So we'll click on start. Rufus is mentioning this is an ISO hybrid image detected. We're going to leave it as the recommended option. Click on OK. And then it's popping up mentioning that it needs to download some files. And we're going to select yes for this. And again, it needs to download some files. Select yes once more. And then here's the warning that it's going to destroy the data on the thumb drive. So once again, make sure that you have everything you need off the thumb drive before continuing. In my case, I don't have anything, so I'll click on OK. And then at this point, just be patient as it works its magic, and then we will continue on. Now, if all goes well, then we should be seeing a green ready state. If an error pops up, then my recommendation is just try again. The other thing is that if it continues to error, then I would reboot the machine, make sure that Windows Defender is still turned off, once again, because it will automatically turn back on with a reboot. So just go through those steps that we did previously, and then try it again. If it's still erroring, it might be worth re-downloading the ISO. If it still errors, it might be worth trying a different USB thumb drive. So you have a few different options if it errors out. Anyhow, at this point, everything looks good. So I'm going to click on close. Next up is going to be the somewhat difficult part of the whole process, and that is getting the machine to actually boot off of the thumb drive. You do have a few options that you can choose. One way to do it is that you can Google your exact make and model of your machine, and then figure out which key you need to press in order to get the machine to actually boot off of the thumb drive. The other option is that if you're on Windows 10 or Windows 11, there is a method to get the machine to go into a recovery state, which would allow you to select the USB drive if you wanted to. So if you wanted to do the recovery option in Windows, all you have to do is go to Start, Settings, System, and then scroll down a little bit until you see the recovery section. You can click on recovery, and then you can have the option for advanced startup, in which case you can click on restart now, and then it will give you an option to select the USB thumb drive or whatnot. So that's one option. I'm just going to go ahead and reboot my machine, and I'm going to mash the special key from my machine, which at least in my case it's F12, but it could be the F2 key, the F4 key, F6, F8, F10, F12, the delete key. So a whole bunch of different options to choose from. Once again, just Google your exact make and model to figure out what the magical key would be, or use the Windows recovery option that I showed off. So anyhow, I'm going to reboot the machine, and then I will mash the special magical key to get us there. I'm going to start mashing the F12 key, at least for my machine. Not all Lenovo's are this key, but that at least is the magical key for mine. Now, not all machines are also going to display exactly the same as this one. However, if you see something along the lines of USB HDD or USB hard disk drive, or it might say USB virtual CD drive, or it might even say USB thumb drive. But basically locate that, in which case hopefully it actually shows up for you. And then with it highlighted, then just hit enter. And then we will wait for it all to load up here. I just want to show that the first screen does give some options. By default, it usually kicks off the graphical install. There is a basic install option that you can choose. There's advanced options. There's the accessible dark contrast installer menu. And then you could also install it with speech synthesis if you really wanted to. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that we select the graphical install, at least for the sake of this video. We'll hit enter. And then just be patient as it loads up. A lot of the peppiness and how fast this loads is of course dependent on the hardware that you've got the USB thumb drive plugged into, and also how fast the USB thumb drive itself is. So once again, really comes down to which hardware is matched with which hardware. Anyhow, the very first page that will pop up is going to be your language selection screen. So choose the language that you need. In my case, I'm going to leave English, so that's fine. I'll click on continue. Next up is the select your location screen. So select your location, and then you can continue on. I'm just going to leave mine as the United States. That's fine. Click on continue. And then next up is going to be configure the keyboard. Once again, choose whichever keyboard you're utilizing. I'm going to leave mine as American English, and I will click continue. And then just be patient as it works. It's some magic at this point, and it's going to go through a series of different screens, but just be patient. At this point, one thing I do recommend, if possible, is plug your machine into a Ethernet cable if possible. The alternative is if you have a wireless controller in your machine that you could connect it to wireless to continue on. So once again, prioritize, if possible, plug it into Ethernet. If it's not possible, you can select wireless and you can go through the steps of connecting it to a wireless network. In my case, I do have wired Ethernet available, so I'm going to choose that and I'm going to click continue and then just be patient. And then next up is going to be the configure the network screen. Now this is the host name or computer name prompt that you will be asked to put something in. You can name this machine whatever you want. In my case, I'm just going to name it something generic. I'll just name it that and we'll click continue. And then next up, if you are connecting it to a domain, then you would be able to type in the domain name here. Most users are not going to have a domain, so you can just leave it as local domain and then click continue. Now this is optional. However, you could type in a password for the root account here, and that would enable the root account. Now, some people prefer to disable the root account for security reasons. If you decide to not utilize a root account, then you could leave these options blank, in which case when you go to create your user, then your user is given sudo capabilities, or basically administrative privileges. In my case, I am going to go ahead and create a root account, but once again, it's completely optional. So once again, if you want a root account, type in a password here. If you do not want a root account for security reasons, leave the two password fields blank and then click continue, and that will disable the root account. But anyhow, like I said, I'm just going to create a root account for the sake of this video, and then I'll click continue. And then next, it's going to ask for an actual user account to be created for non-administrative capabilities. Now, like I said, if the root account if you do not type in a password for the root account, then this user account that you create is actually going to have administrative capabilities. So go ahead and type in a name and then click on continue. And then generally it selects the first name that you type in. In my case, it says digital, and that's perfectly fine, but you can feel free to change it to whatever you want. I'll click on continue, and then it's going to ask you to set a password for this account. So make sure to type in something strong. And then if you did need to view the password, you could click show password in clear for both options. But in my case, I know that I should be fine, so I'll click on continue. Next up is going to be configure the clock. So go ahead and choose the time zone that works best for you. Eastern is perfectly fine for me. I'll click on continue and then just be patient as it continues on with the whole process here. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, the route that we're going with this video is actually installing just Debian on the machine. We're not doing a dual boot scenario. We are strictly making this just a Debian machine, and that is it. I do plan to create another video which will show how to set up dual booting between having Windows and Debian on the same exact machine. But anyhow, for this video, let's use the down arrow and let's go with the guided use entire disk option. There are also the options of setting up LVM and also encrypted with LVM. You can feel free to do research on the side if you feel as though LVM is right for you. And then there is also the option to choose a manual method, which is going to go through a series of steps where you have to manually set the partitions and the sizes and all that good stuff. But usually guided use entire disk works for most people. So we'll click on continue, and then you should see your drive listed of the machine. In my case, I have a 500 gig solid state drive, so that is already highlighted. Here is the thumb drive that I have plugged in. I'm not going to highlight that. We'll click on continue. I am going to leave all files in one partition recommended for new users. There's separate home partition, there's separate home, var, and temp partitions, and then there's even separate var and serve and srv swap for 1 gigabyte for servers. And then there's also the small disk, less than 10 gigabyte partitioning scheme. Like I said, we're just going to leave it as the recommended option. We'll click on continue. And then this is just a preview of what is going to be changed. So if everything looks good in this portion, which to me everything looks perfectly fine, then we will click on continue. Once again, also just to mention is that we are going to nuke all the data on the machine. So if there's anything you need to back up on the machine before you go through this process, then please do so and then go right through the steps that we did previously. Anyhow, I don't have any data that needs to be backed up, so I'll click on continue. And then here's the warning saying it's going to delete the data on the hard drive. Anyhow, I'm perfectly fine with that, so we'll select yes, click on continue, and then just wait for this to work its magic. And it will take a little bit of time, so just be patient. Next up is going to be configuring the package manager, and this is basically pointing us in the direction of what archive mirror do we want the operating system to choose to pull from. In my case, I'm going to just leave mine as United States. However, if you feel you need to change yours to any of the different ones, then feel free to. We'll click on continue. And then I'm just going to leave mine on deb.debian.org. That should do the trick. We'll click on continue. If you're behind a proxy, then you can feel free to change up your proxy configurations at this point. In my case, I am not behind a proxy, so I'll click continue and then just be patient again as it continues to work the magic. Next up is configuring the popularity contest, aka telemetry. So this basically is the opt-in, if you wanted to be able to send anonymous data back to distribution developers if you wanted to. I'm going to leave mine as no, but if you wanted to, you could change this to yes to, once again, give them telemetry data. Anyhow, I'll click on continue. All right, now that we're at the software selection screen, this screen is going to allow us to choose the desktop environment of our choosing, and it also allows for you to set up, for instance, a web server if you wanted, or an SSH server. The key thing to mention at this screen is that anything you set here can always be changed after the fact. So this is a one-stop shop to choose the basics before continuing on. But like I said, if you were to choose, for instance, a desktop environment that you don't actually like in the end, then you can always change it up after the fact. It's no big deal. Now, since this video is going over the Cinnamon desktop, we're going to go ahead and change up what you see here. And it's pretty simple. The key thing is leave the Debian desktop environment checked, uncheck GNOME, and then check Cinnamon. And then, like I said, the web server and the SSH server portion, you could also change at this point. A lot of people may want to turn the SSH server portion on, especially if you are following along with any of my guides on my channel to where I access terminal on the machine remotely. That's where SSH server comes in. But anyhow, for the sake of this video, I am not going to turn that on. But once again, if you don't end up turning it on, but you want it on later, once again, you can add it after the fact. Anyhow, with this set, we can click on continue. And then once again, just be patient. All right, if all goes well, we should see the finish the installation screen and installation is complete. If for some reason it errored out at this point, I would recommend just trying again. If it still errors out, then the other thing is, once again, was Windows Defender actually temporarily turned off and it potentially Pac-Manned the files as Rufus was working the magic. The other thing also is that it could also be that your USB thumb drive is just on the fritz, and it's always worth trying a different USB thumb drive. Sometimes different brand thumb drives can just act weird for some reason. Anyhow, go through kind of the steps that I'd mentioned and see if it makes a dent in the problem that you're seeing. But anyhow, in my case, mine installed okay. So I'm going to click on continue, and then what I'm going to do is as soon as it goes back to my post screen, aka my Lenovo screen or whatever brand yours is, I'm going to pull the thumb drive. So I just pulled the thumb drive, that way it doesn't accidentally boot off of it again, and we'll hopefully have it booting off the main drive here shortly. And this is good. I'm just going to use the down arrow key just to stop the 10 seconds or so that we have before it just automatically continues on with the Debian GNU Linux. But there is the option for the advanced options for Debian GNU Linux. And then there's also the UEFI firmware settings that you could choose. Anyhow, I just wanted to show those off before it continued on. So I'm just going to hit enter to continue with just the default Debian GNU Linux at the top. And then just be patient as it loads up. The first time that it loads, it may be a little bit slower, but just give it some time and it should work the magic. And generally speaking, if you see any errors or anything on here, you generally don't have to be alarmed unless it's actually frozen and it's not actually getting anywhere. Alright, if all goes well, we should be met with the login screen. So let's go ahead and type in our account that we created and the password for it. And we'll hit enter and then the password. And enter once again to log in. Alright, so at this point, Debian 13 with Cinnamon Desktop is basically fully functional. If you would like to see a tutorial of the Cinnamon Desktop, then I'm going to continue on with that right now. So starting in the bottom right-hand corner, to the furthest right, you've got the Show the Desktop button. If you can see it over here, it's, like I said, it's past the clock and to the right of the clock, a tiny little spot right there. So if you had any applications open, you could click on this and then it would minimize everything and you'd see just the desktop, and then you could click it again and everything should pop back up that you had open. To the left of Show the Desktop is going to be your system clock, and if you hover over it, you'll see the day of the week as well as the month and date and year, and then if you left click on it, then it will break it out so that you can see the full calendar. You can change your months, you can change your years, and take a peek at the days. To the left of that is going to be any events if you had scheduled anything on the calendar. And then you also have the date and time settings down below, which we'll go into the settings in general a little bit later on in the video. So we'll click out of that. And then next over to the left is going to be your volume icon or sound icon. You're going to have your volume adjuster. And if you click on the speaker, you can mute the sound. And then if you click it again, and then you can bring the sound back by using your little volume bar there. And then you could also go into the sound settings if you wanted to, which again, I'll show that off a little bit later. And then to the left of your volume icon is going to be your network connection. If you hover over it, it's going to show what your network status is. In this case, I'm connected to the wired network. If you were connected to a wireless network, then I believe it will state that as well. If you left click on it, you'll see the wired option. Again, if you have a wired Ethernet chipset on your machine, and then if you have a wireless chipset of some kind in your machine, then you would have the wireless toggle on or off feature, and then you would also see a number of different wireless networks that you can connect into. I'll have this partially blurred for the privacy of my neighbors. However, below is going to be network settings and network connections that you can also go into. To the left of your network is going to be printers, which I'll dive into a little bit more in the settings section once we get there. And then let's go all the way over to the furthest left. So you're going to have the menu icon, aka what might be considered the start menu, like you would see in Windows. You can left click on this, and then this is going to show you a whole bunch of stuff. So starting at the very top left is going to show Firefox as the browser option. And then below that is System Settings, Pigeon, which is an instant messenger. There's Terminal if you needed to run any terminal commands. You've got Files, which I'll go into a little bit more later. And then below that is Lock Screen, Log Out, and then Shutdown. And just a note, if you click on Shutdown, it actually comes up with a number of options to choose. For instance, Shutdown, Restart, Hibernate, Suspend, and Cancel. We'll click Cancel for right now. I'll go back into the menu. And then in the top section here is going to be a search bar. So you could search for applications if you wanted to. So for instance, I can search for terminal in here if I wanted to. So just to show that you can search for stuff. And then there's going to be your applications and subcategories for applications. So all applications is of course going to show every single application that is on the machine, which as you can see, there is a lot of applications that come pre-bundled, which is pretty nice, especially as it does come with the LibreOffice suite. And then below that is going to be the subcategory for any accessories, applications, any games that are installed, graphics, Internet Office, aka like I said, the LibreOffice suite, sound and video, administration, configurations, preferences, places, and recent files. Recent files, of course, doesn't have any recent documents in here because this is a fresh machine. So to the right of the menu, or what you could call the start menu, is going to be your files, aka what this filing cabinet is. If you left click on this, I'll maximize this. So this is going to give you the option to take a look at the files that are on the machine. At least for right now, it jumped into the digital, aka named accounts profile data. So these are folders that are specific to this user account. However, if you take a look over on the left, then you will have your home, which is where we are currently. And then you can click on desktop. If there's anything on the desktop, it would appear in here. You've got your documents, music, pictures, videos, downloads, recent. Recent's going to be empty because once again, this is a fresh machine. We haven't really gone into anything yet. There's the file system, which is going to show the root file directories of your machine. Also note on the file system, it has this bar down below. That is an indicator of kind of how much free space you have. In this case, we have, as you can see down at the bottom, we basically have 450 gigs of free space. So this thing has plenty of space. There's the trash. If there was any trash in here, you could restore the items or you can empty the trash. And then there is network. So if there's any devices that are discoverable on the network, then you would see them here. In my case, I've got a server on my network, so that's what is showing up in this spot. So we can close out of that for right now. And then to the right of the files or filing cabinet is going to be terminal. And so once again, if you need to run any terminal commands, then you can do so within the terminal to make that magic happen. Close out of that. One thing just to show off before I forget is if you right click on your desktop, then you'll have the option to create a new folder, create a new document, which you have to left click on that for it to appear over here. Create an empty document. You can create a new launcher, add desklets, change the desktop background, display settings, open in terminal, open as root, customize, and paste. So if you copied something, then paste would show up not grayed out, but with actual black text. So let's dive into the settings section. So let's go back to menu and then locate the little knobs or dials for the system settings control center. Let's left click on that. Let's maximize this. Before I jump into just a small handful of these sections, there is a search bar in the top right hand corner. If you want to try to search for specific configurations, you can do so up here. But under appearance, you may want to click on background. So we'll click on that. And you can choose different backgrounds if you wanted to. I'll just choose the Space Fun one, so we'll just double click on that, and that will apply the change to your desktop background. One thing to note is that there is the pictures section, so that you could add any pictures that you wanted to as your desktop background. The other thing you may want to go into is themes. So if we double click on this gives you additional options in choosing what your mouse pointer would look like, application buttons, the icons, and the desktop. You can also add, remove, and there's also a number of settings that you can change up within here. We'll go back, and there's all sorts of different configurations in here, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'm just going to show off a few more that you may want to take a gander at. So once again, there's the network one, which I'm not going to dive into, but this is where you could change up network configurations. There's also the Bluetooth option if you have a Bluetooth controller for pairing Bluetooth devices. There's the disks option. Display configurations can be changed up in here. Printers can be added. However, let's go into power management. One of the big things I want to mention is this top portion. So for instance, turn off the screen when inactive for, at least in this case, 30 minutes. You could change this to never if you really wanted to. I would just leave this on 30 minutes. But if you want to change that, you can. The key one is suspend when inactive. Sometimes this is turned on, and if you are running a desktop, a lot of users want this to be set to never. However, you could change this to make the machine go suspend itself if it's idle for this amount of time. If you're on a laptop, you may want to make sure that it suspends itself so that it doesn't eat up the battery power on your machine. And then there's a number of extra options you can peruse down below, and we'll back out of that. Another big one that people like to take a look at is the system info. So if we double click into this, then this will give you all the information on what your machine is. So if you're curious on the hardware of your machine and the versions of Linux and whatnot that are on here, then you can take a peek at that. So that's all you need to do to get Debian 13 Trixie running with the Cinnamon desktop environment. If you found this video to be useful, please like it and subscribe to my channel to keep up on my latest video happenings. I also invite you to check out my channel if you haven't already, as it has many interesting guides and many more to come. Anyhow, until next time, take it easy.